Alrighty, I think we can get started here. Hi everyone, my name is Charlotte Stowe. I'm the research assistant for the Bright Spots mini lab. We're so glad you're joining us today. Before we get started, we'd like to take a moment to say that while we're gathered here virtually, it's still important to acknowledge that our institutions are situated on the traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of Indigenous people. Here in Minnesota, we're on the land of the Dakota. Minnesota comes from the Dakota name for the region, which is Minnesota Makoche, which means the land where the waters reflect the skies. We're taking this moment to consider their histories, languages, cultures, and we invite you to do the same wherever you're logging in from. Next, just a quick note about our funding. The mini lab is co-sponsored by the Leadership Education and Training Program in MCH Nutrition, as well as the Center for Leadership Education in Maternal and Child Public Health. Both are funded by HRSA's Maternal Child Health Bureau. We're so grateful that these grants provide us with the opportunity to come together today about qualitative research. Next, I'm excited to introduce our speaker today, Stuart Grande. Stuart Grande is a medical sociologist who has always been drawn to the question of how people and communities shape healthcare. His early work explored how peer networks supported Black men's health, a thread that continues to guide his research today. At the University of Minnesota School of Public Health, where he directs the MPH program, he partners with communities to design more person-centered, equitable approaches to care. From studying minors and tuberculosis in South Africa to working with local organizations on housing and health in Minneapolis, his work highlights the power of lived experience to transform systems. Above all, he believes healthcare works best when it listens closely to the voices of the people that it serves. Welcome, Stuart. I'll hand it over to you now.
Wonderful. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Let's see if we can get these to work, and please let me know if you're looking at my notes and you're seeing my cheat sheets. We don't want that to happen. Can you see my slides? Well, yeah, fabulous. Yeah, I'm really excited about this. As I'll talk about in throughout the presentation, this kind of work, being able to talk about history and how to use and think about history in a more meaningful way, and to inform how we perform and conduct research today, is really incredibly valuable. And as I'll say throughout, part of this comes from a very selfish need to find spaces where I can feel comfortable, and it also, I'd like to think, comes from an altruistic place as well, where I recognize in younger versions of myself, in students and in other mid-career and early career researchers, they need a place to sit and be with each other. And it needs to be a safe space, but it also needs to be a little different. And we'll talk about what that little bit of difference means today. So a little bit about me, so you have a little bit of context. I think when I give these presentations, it's good to know who you're hearing from to give a little perspective on whether or not you can trust what I'm saying. And in a qualitative space, how we determine validity and how we determine authenticity really matters. So my background is as a medical sociologist, and also primarily as an educator. You'll see that I've spent time at different universities. When I was at Indiana training for my PhD, I didn't form a method group, but I reached out to different group members. And in fact, a very small group of young men at the time, one of them is on the call today, formed a men's group. And that is maybe a real insight into how our small group survived our time in graduate school. But later, moving to Texas, then later back to New England, and then here, I was part of forming some, I'll quote them, method groups. These were essentially research-oriented or theme groups that met regularly. And this was, again, out of a very strong need to meet people where they were and to train and engage people in conversations that we'll talk about later this morning. My background, as talked about in the opening, is around how people form and build relationships through peer networks, and how those peer networks and how those influences really translate to utilization behaviors, health utilization behaviors in particular. I focus my work around community-based participatory research. I examine and study how patients and providers build relationships together, and I advocate, and we'll talk a little bit about how that shows up in qualitative methodology in a minute. I advocate a bit for this method or framework called shared decision making to achieve some goals, both for patients and for clinicians. And as it was already explained, health and healthcare, in my view, work best when policies and practice are informed by lived experience. I should say too, as we go through, if a question comes up, and I absolutely encourage questions, either speak up or write it in the chat, and I will do my best to pay attention. But if I don't pay attention, somebody call it out to me, because this is supposed to be engaging. As you can tell, I am not reading from a script, because that's not how I roll. This is not how this presentation is supposed to go. It's supposed to be engaging, and there should be some bi-directional exchange here if possible. So I want to acknowledge some folks who along the way have been really supportive in this idea. And I first need to call attention to Dr. Carpenter Song, who is a colleague of mine at Dartmouth, who in our work thinking about mental health in rural New England, we had formed in our own way a very small salon to have more robust conversations about the work we were doing, and how challenging it was situating our work within a medical school. And I'll talk about all of that in a minute. But Elizabeth was a foundational influence and colleague and peer support person for me, and really planted the seed of these salons while I was at Dartmouth. This other group, Katie White, Rebecca Pratt, Catherine, as I knew at Arlinghouse or Hendel, Amy Pittenger, and Jude Michael, all contributed to a paper that we submitted to Academic Medicine. It got strong reviews, a little too strong, but I should have resubmitted somewhere else. And I hope after this conversation, I will be reinvigorated to submit this again. But this paper and this thinking is around how our team, you see some of them here, formed here at the University of Minnesota to support each other, to drive methodology forward, to drive our research question formation, to help each other check the work that we were doing. But these are fundamental beliefs and approaches that this group really helped push forward. So buyer beware. I am not an Enlightenment historian. I would really consider myself a very novice historian. As an undergrad, I mean, that gives me some cachet, I guess, but very limited in terms of people who do this work for a career. So with that, terms and language are representative, but they're not authoritative. My framings will be fictional, not factual. And I want to underscore that this is a flawed, but I hope informative rendering of events that help us examine 17th and 18th century pillar of discourse and what we can learn from there. Wrong direction. All right, we have a poll for you to get us moving in a direction. So if you have access, please let's see what you think. So the question is, as a qualitative researcher or academic, do you ever feel isolated or like you're in the minority within your department or institution? And I'm pretty sure these are anonymous. We can't track you down and call you out later.
Stuart, this is Sarah. I'm sorry I needed to relaunch that poll. Just to let folks know, if you got in right away, please go back and do it. Sorry about that.
No problem. Thank you. I like the data coming in. We're a qualitative group, but
Is the
we
poll?
still we still get excited about numbers, which is great. All right, that's good enough for now. It looks like at least some of the time this is showing up for some of you, and that's 10 of 15, which is in my view, I'm again not going to wield this off as critical, but 67% seems pretty robust for me, and we'll talk about this in a few minutes, and that really gives us context. So being a researcher, specifically a qualitative researcher, we sometimes clearly feel like we're isolated. And as I started the paper for this presentation, we said, qualitative researchers feel like they're on an island in the middle of a positivist ocean. And clearly, many of you agree with that framing. So excellent. Let's see if we can open up poll number 2. All right, so to also move forward, I'd like you to think about, have you ever participated in a formal or informal team to guide your work, research, or teaching? For those of you filling out the yes but found it tedious, I am very interested in those responses. And it's sad to see that there are also a non-zero number of you who've never had the chance to work in a formal or informal team. But it is good to know, and it is refreshing to know that those of you who have worked in teams or doing team science have found it meaningful, or certainly helped your work be better. And that really underscores the value here. But I also want to highlight that later group. This is part of the argument for a salon, and we'll talk a little bit about this in a minute. Communities of practice, which I'll introduce a little later on, situate themselves in this formal and, in my view, tedious form of group work. And I think what we're looking for collectively, what we yearn for, and again, from a very selfish standpoint, is a place where we can sit with colleagues in a way where intellectualism and research questions and approaches can really take on a new life. And that's really what we're talking about here. And hopefully in those situations, I haven't yet read an account of a salon which referred to it as tedious. So hey, there's space to go forward. All right. So here's the agenda for what I'd like us to talk about this morning. So what was this thing, and how do they map onto contemporary collaboration? And I'd like to really identify how it diverges from communities of practice. Those of you who work with or in medicine or healthcare probably are familiar with communities of practice. And this idea of a modern salon is substantively different. I want to talk and reflect on the power of small groups. And I also want to talk about how this is of value for qualitative methods, and how this might find a home in the quote unquote academy. Sorry, I've gone the wrong way again. All right, so the goals here are to deepen your understanding of engagement. And I'd like to disrupt potentially some common assumptions about the accepted approaches to solve wicked health problems. And I'd like to identify tangible benefits of team science as a problem-solving methodology. All right, so here we are. We're back a few hundred years ago and sitting in an 18th century salon with all the accoutrements of the time. I want you just for a moment to sit with this, if you can see it. What we're looking at here is an image of the time of Enlightenment. You get a feeling of very gold encrusted, very flowy costumes, the white wigs. You can capture an image in your mind of of Mozart playing at a harpsichord, and in the background are gilded figures holding clocks and the like. And they're sitting around a fire, of course, on a shade lounge and some other type of lounge chairs, and they're reading or talking around a topic. And this image casts a lot of perspectives and points of view, I'm sure. In modern day existence, this seems incredibly classist. It seems incredibly monocultural. There's not a lot of diversity represented here, and there is certainly questions of validity to either methodology, rigor, or some larger political movement. It seems quite fluffy, and it seems quite off in terms of trying to drive an academic, rigorous conversation. But I want to give it some context. So salons emerged as a product of the French Enlightenment, and this is incredibly important to think about. And it is an idea that these salons were part of a new kind of thinking. And to give you some context to that, it is an elevated role of a salonière who, as a woman, would be forced out of common accepted public areas of conversation, particularly around the state, or in particular to the monarchy. So women's voices were isolated and asked not to participate. And so this unique quality of the salonière in this time was to organize and to bring together through a type of sampling that's probably more relationship and stature based than anything else, but incredibly valuable. And the point that I bring here is that this reflected the conversations that existed in the salon at the time, brought forth this active tension between what was said and done and displayed in a public space versus what was said and done and articulated in private spaces. And this has been talked about, especially for people who were of the aristocratic class, that this was a space where somebody could live in both the private and public spheres safely. And really, you could use a modern framing of coding. So coding in as a public representation, coding in as a private representation. And this idea of a dual citizenship, a member of the state, but also a critical thought, critical thinker against what the monarchy stood for and what they were doing. And these salons really, truly existed as a response, an exclusionary a response to exclusionary practices by the monarchy to isolate people and to isolate their ideas. And so this, as it's been referred to, Republic of Letters, really challenged core visions and truisms that the monarchy put forward. And these salons were places that, and you can think, and I don't know if you have the time to do this, but if you read Rousseau is, and this is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, that wrote a great deal and contested the idea of women's roles. And as a famous misogynist, or has been referred to as a famous misogynist, Rousseau really held women in a different position than men. And so the voice of women was, in Rousseau's framing, less than, and certainly not equal to, that of men. And so consequently, the creation of a salon and the role of a salonière to bring people together, to forge these conversations around writings and active thinking against current practice in the political and public spaces was really novel. And ostensibly this happened for about 200 years. About 200 years, and right up until the revolution in 1789. And so we see through the Enlightenment this real pursuit of knowledge, and how the pursuit of knowledge was driven mainly in part by these private spheres of influence. And I don't want to say that nobody, like, how, you may ask the question, how can these exist if they were all private? How could they have an impact if it was all private? It turns out that many of the saloniers at the time were, in some form, they were either the wife or matriarch of a gentleman who happened to have a place in the monarchy or a role at court. And so these were outside of those roles, but the thinking, the acts, the writing, the sharing, the engagement, the discourse, made it into the ears of men at court, and it also made it into the public spheres for those folks outside of the court. And many argue that this was a strong contribution to the revolution, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So what was this? It was private. It was highly codified. It was a social gathering, and it was predominantly in the homes of wealthy women. And as I talked a bit about that already. So what were they? What was the social context of this space? Well, they served as key centers of high society. It was very social, but it also existed in parallel to the monarchy. So it wasn't an arm of monarchy. It was separate. And in these spaces, what did they do? They shared writing. They wrote things down. And we have a very, this Republic of Letters exists and gives us real insight into what the conversations were and who was at the table or who was in the room, so to speak. And so this is an area where ideas were pushed, and they were provocative, and they couldn't be said out in public for fear of retribution or worse. So what was the primary function of this space? Well, it was primarily to connect these categories of human life, and bring them together. For example, it wasn't boring. And so those of you who say, when you think about forming a research group, oh, it's tedious and it just, ugh. And that's not, I'm not saying fun, but I'm saying engaging. It was a social experience. It was a way for people to connect, and how that must have felt in the 18th century when the monarchy was doing its own thing, and there was very little access to decision making in those spaces, and forming groups and culture, to raise awareness and to give people voice. It was really a quite powerful thing. And it is the core, I would argue, and so I'm arguing based on Dana's work, that is the sole civil support system for what we know today as the Enlightenment. All right, poll number 3. This is me getting you in the mood, as it were. So when faced with a research challenge, which environment do you think would be most effective for generating innovative solutions? Please choose one of the 3. So a formal structured team, clear leader and defined roles, an informal diverse group of peers who meet openly to debate and share ideas, or working independently to minimize groupthink and maintain control. There is obviously a selection bias for those of you who come to a qualitative mini lab. I certainly understand that. And if I were to share this with others in the academy, for example, it might, number 3 might be the strongest form of self-solution or self-guided solution to problem solving. But all right, it looks really strong here that many of you are in this space where, an informal group of peers to openly debate and share ideas. I am thrilled. This is brilliant. So clearly there's there's interest and there's motivation for this informal formation of groups. And there are a few of you out there who like clear structures. And I should say too that in our modern space, we have got to make sure that the people that we invite into these rooms, into these spaces, represent all kinds of interests and work very differently. It would be no good, it would be no benefit to any of us if we simply had affinity groups where everybody was the same and we just sat around and all nodded our heads all the time. That doesn't help anyone. It's certainly not in the method space. So wonderful. Thank you all for contributing. It's really helpful. I'm going to get into a space now where we think about how this salon that I introduced may translate into our current social world. And so I think there's a lot to be said, and some of you agree that there is some real strength in informal learning. And I want to say that from the groups that I've formed at the different institutions I've spent time at, this has been really the tension in those spaces, especially when they get a little too large. People don't feel like they can share. They don't feel like they have the self-efficacy to bring controversy to the table. Maybe that is a part of the organizer, me and my team, to not create a space of psychological safety. But the core here is that maybe it was the formality. Maybe that smaller, more informal settings are the way to drive this free thinking concept. Also, I want to put out that, in today's world, we are very disconnected, but at the same time, based on Zoom and some other technologies, we are incredibly connected. Our social networks are rich, and the question is, how do we bring those into a shared informal space? And this is really where we need to be thinking. This is really how we should be thinking going forward. And one of the pieces I think that I really get fired up about and really get excited about with the Salon is that it's about intellectual freedom. And in the academy today, in particular, saying intellectual freedom is under threat, and certainly academic freedom is under threat. And more importantly, the act of political agitation takes on a very different meaning today, I think, than it did in 1780s. And today, agitation needs to be and should be intentional. It should also be thoughtful. And informal gatherings allow for some of that to happen, and that give and take, to understand where the boundaries and the parameters of where polite agitation and potentially harmful agitation sit. So I would like to say that we've got these things in existence, and I suggested this. I was suggested this after the submission of this paper, and the reviewer said, "Well, don't you know anything about communities of practice? We already do this." And to which I said, absolutely, you do not. And I've sat in communities of practice, and they're not the same. And so I'd like us to think through, what the difference is between what I'm calling, well, I will call soon a new or a modern salon, but I want to talk about what the salons of the past look like and what communities of practice today look like. So the mindset in these two different spaces is incredibly important. So in the past, it was a creative space for political and intellectual freedom. And today, this is much more about solving problems. What are the outcomes? What are we trying to achieve? What are the skills we need? Why, and what's the motivation for these groups? In the past, it was social gain, intellectual enjoyment, and seeking protection from others and seeking support from others through personal relationships. But in communities of practice, we see that much more professionally, and there's this, again, a very clear presence of a standard or an expertise that needs to be achieved. Whereas in the past, it was much more open and much more flexible. So the context of these. So in the past, these were very private spaces, doors closed, it was comfortable, there were couches and drinking, and I don't need to hold back because I'm talking about 18th century France, but there were wine and there was a lot of innuendo, sexual innuendo, and all of that kind of stuff. And, you know, as Rousseau has written, this is not the space for intellectual pursuit. But we know now, looking back, that it absolutely was. But if we look at that kind of idea and what it looks like today, where you are forming these in a conference room, just the nature of saying conference room, oh man, my cortisol spikes a little bit. So how do we create the space that allows for this open discourse? And the last piece, what is the practice of doing this? And in the past, in the salons, this was about aesthetics and being witty and being able to use words to your advantage. It was also about style and how you expressed language, a really different form of conversation than today. And today, it's much more about, are you using the right tools? Do you talk about the tools in the right way? Are you sampling correctly? Have you controlled for the right variables? This is what we are managing today. Whoops, again, I went the wrong way. So I'd like to point out that there are two views, two concepts of small groups. One is a little bit more skeptical and identifies this very objectively subjective view, don't hold me to that, of small groups. So when you assemble a number of men, of course, to have advantage of their joint wisdom, you assemble with those men all their faults, their prejudices, their passions, their errors of opinion, and their selfish views. From such an assembly can a perfect production be expected? As you can tell from the date, this was around the Constitutional Convention. So again, we have a small group coming together, but it was around a goal, creating something that had worldly value. But let's look at a more positive side of this argument. And the other side of looking at small groups is never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. And indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And Margaret Mead, as of course a world-renowned anthropologist, recognized that small groups are really powerful tools. And again, you know, small groups also, especially those that form within organizations or out of organizations, are required. And my father-in-law, who was an entrepreneur and helped design and develop fish vaccines, that's right, so fish don't get sick when they're being farmed and all the rest, worked with a lot of organizations that, like 3M, Dow, Cargill, and the like. And the scientists that exist in these places, over a course of time, end up having a shared mind. They get a shared mindset. They start acculturating to the same behaviors and ways of doing things. And there isn't a lot of creativity. And so these groups, these organizations, end up paying fortunes to outside consultants to bring in innovative ideas. And this is the same thing with the academic space. We are always seeing new faculty hires coming in, faculty leaving to do something different. I mean, this is what innovation is all about, and particularly with methods and research. And I would say that small groups also are uniquely fit to overcome the hierarchical and particularly bureaucratic rigidity that exists in these spaces. And in academia, where this is absolutely the case, where freedom of thought and intellectual and academic freedom is, depending on the division and department that you work, where you work, they change, and they're very different. But these small groups, they are about process over perfection. And it's about working against this concept of, do you meet this standard and this, what we expect from how you're supposed to work? And potentially, if you set up small groups to act outside of that seeking external validation, maybe, just maybe, that curiosity can drive innovation. There's also this idea of bringing these groups together who don't get to spend time together because they're siloed. They're in this massive organization. This is an opportunity for know-how to be shared, where senior researchers can come together with staff and students and early career researchers to share experiences and learn about how these methods and models are presented. All right, our last poll question. In your opinion, what is the biggest barrier to promoting methodological rigor and community voice in academic medicine today? The emphasis on individual metrics and hyper competition, lack of institutional support or funding for qualitative approaches, finding a diverse group of collaborators with the right expertise, and skepticism from colleagues who favor quantitative research. What is the biggest barrier to promoting methodological rigor and community voice in academic medicine today? Ooh, good distribution. So I'd like to think in the next few slides, I'm going to offer some possible insight, maybe some new thinking, or maybe give some clarity to how these approaches might work today, and why they are valuable. I think, you know, from the data here, there is a very strong emphasis on individual merit. Many tenured and non-tenured faculty are judged on how many publications, how many grants they bring in, not their team, but they bring in. There is an across the board an underfunding of qualitative only research. And this is a talk for a different time, but thinking about how qualitative research fits within broader research methodologies. And again, in small groups, in dynamic, informal, intellectual, methodological conversations and discourse, it's possible to think about avenues and innovative avenues for these types of methodologies. It is really difficult, and I think you all have identified that here, to find diverse group of collaborators with the right expertise to solve the particular question that's being posed. And you know, the last one's more of a personal vendetta that I may have, but it's this idea. Someone wrote in the chat, religious fervor for quantitative methods. Indeed. But there is skepticism from colleagues who favor quantitative research, and it's really difficult in a lot of circles, and understanding, especially in the medicine and public health spaces, how numbers drive research dollars gives us insight into understanding what really the true source of our problems are. And if we all recognize that, I'll shift into the next slide as I continue this thought. If we all recognize the limitations of current methods, we have an implementation problem, and there's also a replication problem in STEM and outside of STEM, in social science. When you repeat the same experiment or quasi-experimental design in practice, can it be repeated? And we have a replication issue. So fundamentally, there's an issue with how we're doing science. So this rigor is needed, in order to answer or address the question of, are we approaching this question in the right way? And so I will admit, and this is part of the paper, there are serious limitations to the qualitative approach. In many medical spaces and public health spaces, there's a lack of guidance and mentorship. There is a lot of this qualitative light, and many of the people who practice understand what I mean by this. Simply running a focus group and doing some quick thematic analysis, that's sufficient. Man, that stuff gets my blood boiling. There's also, having reviewed lots of work, there's a misapplication of all sorts of qualitative methods. And these small groups offer real chances and opportunity to make sure that these don't occur. There's also a lack of transparency and objectivity with qualitative work, and I can't wait to dive into that in a minute. And then there's always this feeling of feeling siloed, and that you're the underdog, and you're doing your best to make it to the top because you're competing with the big dogs, and all of that kind of rhetoric. My view is that reviving the salon gives us clear support and routine exposure to others who do this work and do it successfully. It overcomes this qualitative light through fostering debate and strategy, and talking about reflection and how this work impacts the world and each other over just getting it done, getting it published, getting it out. By having a small group meet routinely and with trust that there's this shared learning, and that it can leverage individual experience in these spaces to overcome this clear misinterpretation of various methods. And there's always a challenge to who's doing this work. And when you have students do it, they don't really understand triangulation. They don't understand qualitative validation. In small groups designed to foster sharing and learning, there is a way for these groups to hold each other accountable. Have you asked these questions? Have you followed up with your sample? Have you gone back? Have you shared the data with them? And so forth and so on. And in the end, ultimately, I feel very strongly that these spaces, these salons, are a way to advocate for each other. It's a way to bring advocacy and collective action in the academy. If all these well-respected people are doing this work, we have to pay attention, shouldn't we? So how do we do this? How do we create a space for discovery and collaboration? So my one way of thinking about this is, it does this because we can enhance qualitative methods. It gives us space to read and proof each other's ideas. It's a journal club with balloons, but that's not really what we're talking about. What I'm talking about is fitting ethnography, photo voice, autoethnography, or other critical qualitative inquiry into built structures and hierarchies that exist in our systems already. And how about we use these methods as advocacy and activation, getting people fired up about problems that exist in our society. For example, health disparities, or underuse or misapplication of resources to certain populations. And this is really what gets us fired up around applying these ideas to marginalized peoples, but also applying marginalized approaches. And these marginalized approaches are how it's reflected in broader public health and medical communities. So how do we bring these things together and put it into the mainstream? And I think one of the strongest values of qualitative method and using salons to drive this methodology is it's about critical inquiry. Again, if we are just doing the method because that's what we know, we are going to continue perpetuating problems. We just look at them from a different point of view. That's not helpful. What we need to be doing is asking deeper questions. What can we do to fix this problem? Are we doing enough? Do we have the right team? This is what we need. We also need this salon because it needs to be a space where we can connect and disagree in comfort. I think this is where we can gain some social and aesthetic fulfillment, and we feel less siloed in our world. So this encourages engagement. So we can bring things that we've read and wrote. We can also talk about things that don't necessarily reflect getting an objective completed, where we can talk about news of the day, certain new books or new concerts or whatever the case may be. And you know what, as I mentioned before, keeping these things within the academy, like in a conference room, for example, really does not translate to aesthetic fulfillment. I think, and as I alluded to at the beginning, you know, my experience in graduate school and others have also experienced this, where they form small groups of peers to sit with drink. Doesn't have to be with drink. I don't mean that. I'm just, this is in reflection of the salon, right? So that's all, it's all fair game at this point. I don't think I'm being too lascivious in any of my characterizations of the salon. Probably not lascivious enough. Anyway, thinking about this, you know, this group of young men who met once a week and were able to share deep personal views and experiences and challenges really drove home a lot of possibility. And you know, arguably for us and others, it was a way to survive the rigors of graduate school. And I want to pose this as I pull things together. Another wonderful quote from Margaret Mead. I wonder if one never did a single thing to please another person which didn't spring from one's own desire, not one's desire to please them, to fit in with their different view or what is lovely or right or necessary. Would these relationships be honest? And I think this cuts to the quick of what it is to be a peer mentor, a support, and really shapes the space of the modern salon around honesty and bringing your full self to these spaces, which I think in the academic world is very difficult to do. All right, and that's the end of that. So thank you for showing up, and if you've got questions and you want to discuss any or all of this, let's dive in.